Yes. Sharing the screen now. You're free to switch on or switch off your video. Doesn't matter for me now. But keep your mic on the mute, just in case if anybody has switched it on, so that there is no echo or any kind of disturbance. So I'll just give you a idea of what we are going to do today. Hope you are able to see this. Can anyone give me an audio confirmation? Can you see this clearly? What's on my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
fine. So this is, I'm taking a very small portion because it's the first class and I have only 2 hours. So I'm it's a relatively big unit, but I've taken up these things: social influence, and under that, at least as per the syllabus, this is what we have: conformity, peer pressure, persuasion, compliance, obedience, social power, and reactance. Then I just added this part, which was put separately in the syllabus, but I think, because when we are dealing with social persuasion, we are talking about attitude change, and therefore we need to understand it within the cultural context too. And today, with the evolution of cross-cultural psychology, this is becoming important. I have seen culture-related questions in the previous net questions, so I think that's very important too. So we will be dealing with these topics. I will be using PowerPoint so that it's easy for you, because many people, particularly on the online, they find it difficult to keep their focus and take down notes. So to facilitate things, to make things easy, I am going to use a PowerPoint. So my video output also is available, I believe, and you could see the screen output too. So both will be available, and it's easy for you to take notes. You don't miss out anything. So we'll be going through these topics using PowerPoints. I'm planning to do quick revisions of the PowerPoints as and when we finish it. Like each set of slides, we'll just rush through it again so that it stays in our memory. After that, in every class, I'm planning to take up some terms, because net exams decides on a lot of concepts, jargons. You need to be very clear about what they mean. So randomly, there might be some terms which are slightly exotic. Some might be, which you might be seeing in basic text, the mix of all these things. So I'll be just take whatever we discuss related to that. I'll be taking some terms and taking you through that. It will be a kind of double revision. Then we'll take a few questions from previous years, or otherwise related to this area a little bit. Today I couldn't find all the questions related because we have taken a very small area, but I have taken some 10 questions. We'll be going through those questions. We'll discuss those things. And then I'm having a set of slides where I am using pictures in a slightly more interesting format, bringing in some trivia and trying to get across the concepts, whatever we have seen, in a much more visual way. Let's see how it goes. So that will be the last thing. So this is what we have. So hope you have the structure for the class, and this is how the structure is going to be every week. Now let me start with we just will go by the syllabus itself. I'll start with, we'll do one thing. I'll take up social persuasion. That covers a lot of things. Then we'll go to attitude and its change in cultural context, or we'll do persuasion and then we'll go and finish conformity, compliance, obedience, because those 3 things technically will come under social influence. So we will do social persuasion, social influence, then attitude change, and lastly we will come to peer pressure. Reactance. Reactance is, maybe we could finish it earlier and keep peer pressure at the end. Okay. So we'll start with social persuasion. So when it comes to social persuasion, we have something called the Yale University approach, or the Yale approach, where we hope you all know about the basics. So I'm not spending too much of time on what is attitude and things like that. Attitude is just whatever you evaluate around you, whatever it could be, in a positive or a negative manner. That's called attitude. And when we try to change these attitudes, particularly we use the word persuasion to refer to those efforts or techniques to bring about an internal change, to bring about changes in your values, to bring about changes in your attitudes, your thoughts, your beliefs, without putting an external pressure on your behavior. That would become social influence. The social persuasion refers to a kind of internal, facilitating an internal change. So that's where we are. And Yale University approach was one of, because most of the research, earlier research related to this happened at this university. And this is where people like Carl Hoagland and others did a lot of studies, and they came up with whatever they studied, they came up with these set of ideas that is in front of you. Basically, this was an approach of trying to divide a persuasive communication into the source, the message, and the audience. The three things are there. The source, there are different aspects related to the source. If these characteristics are there, then the persuasion would be high. If it is not there, the persuasion would be weak. That kind of thing. The message, how the message has to be presented. So there are some characteristics related to that. Then, whom should be targeted? Who would be easily persuadable than others? So that is the audience. The three kind of things. So when we take up the who speaks or who is the persuader, who is giving you the persuasive communication, things like attractiveness, human nature. Of course, attractiveness is very subjective. Some people come up with a theory of symmetry. The evolutionary psychology people always talk about the golden ratio, symmetry, and stuff like that. But I believe it's much more than that. Some way there is attractiveness. I think that would have a greater impact on persuasion. Point number one. Point number two, credibility. Credible sources. The person who is trying to persuade you should be seen as trustworthy and knowledgeable about what he or she is talking. So that kind of authority, a person who is an authority on that would be more credible. A scientist talking about his or her area of research would be seen as more credible, and we are more likely to believe what they say and bring about changes in our thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors in line with that. Before I go in, we should remember that social influence is targeted on the behavioral change. That doesn't mean internal change won't happen. Same way, social persuasion is targeted on the internal change. That doesn't mean that external behavioral change won't happen. More likely, it is likely to happen. Yeah. Coming back to the the message, how the message is presented. The message has, there is something, the two approaches, hard sell and soft sell. Hard sell is where a lot of pressure is put on you. Sometimes the shopkeepers put too much of pressure on you, keep on telling that you should buy it and things like that. Or soft sell, it's just walk into my shop, have a look, that's it, you don't need to buy. That's a soft sell, that kind of thing. So basically, that's one aspect of it. Then there is one-sided versus two-sided message. Always, the Nazi propaganda. Those guys were always telling that one side is the best. Why are you confusing? Why are you bringing the other side? Just keep telling the same thing again and again, drum it into people. But these people came up with an idea saying that, no, we need to have a two-sided one. You see, the two-sided one works better with people who are in the middle, who are sitting on the fence, who have not decided which is right, which way to go, or people who are against your position. Okay, whoever are against your position. Say, for example, you want to convince people that we should abstain from any kind of drugs, but the audience do not believe in it. So they have an opposite point of view. For those people, the two-sided message. Two-sided message basically starts with their own opinion. Probably that would make them trust you. But then slowly you counter those things with an arguments and come to the opposite side. So that's a two-sided message. Then you have the positioning of the message. Say, for example, if the ad, which is placed at the beginning of the movie or after the end of the movie or end of the cricket match, whatever, Either way, it's better. The primacy effect or recency effect. This was the primacy effect was first referred to by Frederick Hansen Lund. He said that anything that comes first is attended to, and therefore the chance of being persuaded is higher. These are not guarantees, but it's better. So that's primacy effect. Recency effect is the last one that you hear. Anything in the middle might get lost. So this is another thing. Then emotions are very powerful forces. We can use humor, we can use sex, we can use anger, we can use pride, honor, we can use fear. Any of these emotions can be used, but we have to be careful. If you overdo it, it might backfire, particularly the negative emotions, particularly fear. Again, in general, research says that if you overuse fear, people tend to go into a defensive mode. Okay, people may stop if you keep on saying smoking causes cancer, and show them all very graphic images of the lungs and cancerous lungs and other kind of things. Then people will stop attending to your message, even try to go against it. I'll come to that later on. So we need to be very careful about that. Then people who speak fast, loud, they are perceived to be authority on those things, and the persuasion might be high. A very common sense kind of things, all these things. Then to whom? The audience. Of course, there are other kind of things like advertisers use, or unethical methods like distracting you. When they provide distraction so that you don't process the lack of logic in the persuasive message that you are putting across. Yes, that could be a problem. That is why I didn't list it out here. But remember, distraction can also be used as a method of increasing the power of persuasion, which is not a very ethical one, by the way. Anyway, the kind of audience. So when you talk about audience, yeah, distraction I put here, but distraction as a method of message delivery can be there. Young people, yes. Again, in psychology, there is no absolutes. So you can't say all illiterate people, all uneducated people can be easily persuaded. No. But there's a possibility with certain issues, certain complicated issues, there is a possibility that people with lower intelligence, people with less education or exposure might be, getting persuaded. Younger people, the better. And people who have low self-esteem are also easily persuadable. So these are some of the things which Yale University researchers figured it out. In general, in social influence also, in social persuasion also, reciprocity is a very important principle. Reciprocity. This is very human nature. A scientist called Gigerenzer includes this reciprocity as a heuristic. Reciprocity heuristic. He says it's automatic. We have evolved to have this. If somebody helps you, you help them back. If somebody hurts you, you hurt them back. If somebody changes their opinion when you talk about it, you are more likely to listen to them and bring about a change in your own opinion. Reciprocity. And framing, I will also talk about that later in detail. How you frame the message. In general, there are two ways, like positive framing and negative framing. I'll talk about that in detail later. Just right now, keep this in mind. Moving on to the next slide. Later on, see this earlier approach, Yale approach was more of a passive approach, where those days we were not thinking too much, at least because of cognitive revolution, happened a little bit later, the cognitive psychology, where we emphasize on what kind of responses are triggered in your brain in response to stimuli. Those things were not there at that time. Probably that's why the Yale approach was more outside your head. But later on, the other theories started getting into people's head and trying to understand what kind of responses these people produce when they hear, a stimuli, when they hear a persuasive message. So Greenwald was one of the first persons to talk about the cognitive response model, where he said that, see, ultimately, when you hear a persuasive message, what thoughts are generated? Are they positive? Are they negative? Are these thoughts, how many thoughts are there? These kind of things. Naturally, more thoughts, more positive thoughts, more possibility for persuasion. Negative thoughts, less possibility for persuasion. So that is what he talked about. So he was the first one to talk about the internal factors, the cognitive process. Then there was a big fight about people saying that there are more than one process of persuasion. This fight is going on. Let the psychologists keep this a very evolving subject. But for us, we need to know these theories. There are the two theories which comes under the dual process model of persuasion. What they say is, in two ways we will process the persuasive message. One in a very serious manner, systematic manner, where we take and analyze all the facts in a very serious way. Another one is a very shortcut method, almost less than conscious way, and we try to focus on the superficial kind of clues in the persuasive messages, not the content itself. You might have heard about this book Fast and Slow Thinking by Daniel Kahneman. So there is usually in psychology they talk about system 1 and system 2, two types of thinking. System 1 is the fast heuristic one, and the system 2 is the deliberate, slow, conscious kind of thinking. So you could relate this to that. Cacioppo and Petty came up with a theory called elaboration likelihood model, and Chaikin came up with a heuristic systematic model. Both models are same in the sense that central route and peripheral route. That central route is similar to the systematic route of Chaikin, and the peripheral route is similar to the heuristic method which Chaikin talks about. So you could just keep them in mind. So basically, see, if I want to change someone in a very long-lasting way, if I want to make the persuasion very effective in a sustainable manner, then I should encourage that person to process it in the central route or the systematic route. Because putting all the facts and logic in front of them and making them think about it in detail would definitely automatically eventually bring about a long-lasting internal change. But if I don't want, because what I'm trying to tell them doesn't have solid facts or logic, I'm just trying to sell it off to this person, this idea. So what I would do is I will encourage the peripheral route, where I would be investing more on the background music, the looks of the persuader and things like that. Okay, moving on to the next thing. Social judgment theory. These are the new things. New in the sense added over a period of time. Sharif and Hovland came up with these things. It just says that it's not blind and automatic. People are not, head is not a vacuum. We all have some kind of attitudes, some kind of beliefs already. So when somebody is coming to persuade you to change your opinion or form a new opinion in you, you might already have a belief system or an opinion or an attitude prior to that. And when you hear a persuasive message, you compare it with your prior opinion or attitude or belief. And if it is in line with that, you're more likely to open your ears and hear to that and try to listen carefully. Probably allow that change to happen. But if it is completely against your line of thinking, you may selectively avoid listening to that, or even selectively listen to certain aspects of what the speaker is speaking, things like that. So this says that we make judgments. We make judgments on the persuasive message. Is this right or wrong? If it's right, I will listen. If it's wrong, I will just shut down. That's it. Then the narrative paradigm. It's a beautiful thing. Walter Fisher, this guy tells that there is a lot of overlap between social sciences like anthropology, sociology, and psychology. You have areas like symbolic interactionism, constructivism, all these kind of things where they talk about how you perceive things, and probably in line with that, what Walter Fisher says that humans are basically storytelling creatures. We love to tell stories, we love to listen stories. So persuasive messages need not be always rational, logic loaded and facts loaded. It could be bound in a beautiful story where people could relate to the characters and get into that drama and feel it, and that's how it has to be done. No doubt about it. A lot of advertisements even today create small stories and things like that. So narrative paradigm talks about persuasive messages has to be beautiful stories. Then you have dissonance theory given by Leon Festinger. He says that whenever human beings, again, this Festinger's idea, it owes its origin to Gestalt theory. Gestaltists, you all know that, they talk about the holistic way of looking at things. See, we are a system of equilibrium. we are all homeostatic mechanisms. We love to maintain balance. Doesn't mean we'll always be in balance, but balance is the optimal state. So whenever we say something, we do something else, or we have one value and another value which contradict each other, or our attitude and behavior are in dissonance, discordant with each other, then we would feel something what Festinger called as dissonance. It's a very uncomfortable state. You could call it as a drive state, an uncomfortable psychological state which drives you to remove that discomfort and thereby restoring balance. Okay, so dissonance theory of Festinger. Then Dolores theory, cognition and persuasion model. This is something, you remember this dual process model. This is something that integrates this dual process model. It says that, see, we focus on the content, logic, facts, right? That's very important. But the other things also, the superficial clues, the peripheral clues, those things. What is the gender of the person? The person belongs to a prestigious social status or not? All those kind of things, which are not relevant to the content actually. But all those cases, like here I have given examples of voice, what we call as para-language. All these things they look at and mix these things, and both these things combine to have an effect on our attitudes, whether it changes or not. Moving on to the next. Basically, persuasion, it's better if you self-persuade yourself. That also happens because many a times we form attitudes, we change attitudes ourselves. Nobody would be explicitly trying to persuade you or influence you, but you might be just reading things, seeing things around you, thinking, and trying to persuade yourself and try to bring about such changes. So self-persuasion will always result in sustainable changes. Then there is a theory called self-perception theory by Daryl Bem. Daryl Bem, what he said is it's something like the opposite to common sense view. You do something, okay, and then you're wondering, why did I do this? You look for answers in the environment. Why did I do this? If I don't get a clear answer from the environment, then I decide, probably I should have an attitude in line with my behavior. That's why I should have behaved like this. For example, you shout at a transgender who came and approached you, okay? And there was absolutely no reason in the environment to make you do that. The transgender was very decent. I mean, there's no compulsion, outside compulsion that forces you to behave like that. Then you might infer, probably, I have a prejudice against transgenders. That's why. So you arrive at consciousness of an attitude by observing your behavior. That is what Daryl J. Bem talked about. Then you have sleeper effect. Sleeper effect was given by Hovland again. It's a very beautiful thing. Most of the time it happens to all of us. See, there is a persuasive message. Say person X tries to persuade you, he or she gives you this information. Fine. I will give you the full picture. You don't like this person, you don't trust this person. Okay. But human memory is a very strange thing. Over a period of time, your memory undergoes changes. One aspect of forgetting is we forget from where you did this. Say just read right if yes, switch off the mic, please do mute it. So you need to, you are able to remember the message but forgot the source. It's similar to what we call, not same, but similar to what we call a source monitoring error. There is an error, and here we go beyond that. You forget it. You do not know where did you get it from. So initially, you don't accept this message because you don't like the source. You don't see the source as credit worthy. Therefore, you just say no. But over a period of time, this memory of this message and disconnected from the source slowly gains credibility, and that initial resisting clue, that the source is bad, that is gone. That is no more preventing you, and therefore slowly this message might gain credibility and might influence your attitude to change and your behavior to change. That is what he called as sleeper effect. This is William McGuire's 6-step model of persuasion. Very, very common sense thing, but net exam, sometimes they ask you these steps. Sometimes they will ask you the right order of these steps. Sometimes they will give you a collection of things and tell which of these are included in the 6-step model of persuasion. So you need to memorize these things. You have, so always use acronyms, EAC, ARA. Okay, let's keep it that way. Exposure, you have to be exposed to the message. Just like being exposed doesn't mean you have attended to it, so you should compulsorily attend to it. Second one. Third one is you have to understand it, you have to comprehend it. Once you comprehend, you accept it, then you need to keep this in your memory. That's why advertisers keep on doing it, because they want you to remember the brand, the product, and things like that. Therefore, you have this remembering part, and finally, that becomes the behavior. Okay, that's an action. The 6-step model of persuasion by McGuire. Moving on to other things. I've collected as many information possible, related to social persuasion, so that we don't miss out on anything. Still, there will always be some questions which you might find it difficult. That will always be there. Any exam, for that matter, there will be high difficulty items, so we should not worry too much about that. But we should try to prepare ourselves as much as possible. Subliminal persuasion. Subliminal, as you know, of course, it derives its origin to Freud and psychodynamic approach and things like that. Basically, below your conscious threshold. Anything below your conscious awareness. Today, modern science has accepted that something of this sort. If you don't accept Freud in its entirety, still there is, your brain can receive information, but you may not be aware of it because it's below the conscious awareness. Can we be persuaded subliminally? That means, can we be persuaded by messages which are below our conscious threshold? There are subliminal self-help tapes. You play the tape, you play the CD, you play the song. You might hear only the song consciously, but there is some kind of positive quotes or inspiring kind of information which is subliminally recorded, and that will have an impact on you. People do sell, such kind of subliminal stuff. Can we be really persuaded, like that? It looks very freaky. Like people could be, without their knowledge, they could be persuaded to do anything that even they may not have thought of. But modern science clearly says that subliminal perception, yeah, it's there. But to persuade a person to change their attitude, values, beliefs, no, that's too complex a phenomena. If ever some very subtle kind of changes happens, it's so temporary and so shallow, we don't need to worry about it. Then, as I told you, I told you that I will talk about this positive and negative framing. Positive framing is whenever you put across information, you highlight the advantages, the gains that you're going to make. Negative framing is you're going to highlight the risks, the dangers, and things like that. What they say is, when you try to persuade people, see, there are personality variations. Some people are what they call as promotion-focused people. Some people are prevention-focused people. Promotion-focused people always look for the positive gains, what they're going to make. And prevention people are always going to look at the losses, the risks involved. So I think according to that, we should persuade. So determining the nature of audience, we should try to put across either positive messages or negative messages. Yeah, for example, you could say that you eat healthy, so these fruits and vegetables, you're going to be healthy. That's a positive framing. You say that you don't have these things, it might you might have you eat less of these fruits and vegetables, you might have colon cancer. You're highlighting the negative things. So there is this theory of Higgins, regulatory focus or regulatory fit theory. Ultimately, the persuasion is to match with the audience, with their orientation. Apart from this, there are certain things which I need to touch upon when we discuss about persuasion. Forewarning can prevent or I will say will increase the resistance to persuasion in people. Okay, for example, there is an audience and you tell them, see, these guys are going to come and tell you all these things. Be careful. They are bad people. They don't have your interest in their mind, and be warned. That's it. It's enough to increase the resistance to persuasion. This is what political parties will do to each other. Then, as we discussed already, selective exposure, selective avoidance is human nature. You tend to focus only on those things which in line with your thinking. So you will read only those magazines. You will hear only those speeches. So you yourself will put a filter whom to listen to, whom not to listen to. Then attitude inoculation is a very interesting concept. McGuire found a similarity between the medical concept of inoculation, and he came up saying that, see, basically, when you are inoculating a person, you fight a weakened form of the organism. Initially, you train your immune system to fight the weakened form, and then when the real thing, the real pathogen comes, your immune system is stronger and it's able to battle that pathogen in a better way. That is what we call as attitude inoculation. He applied the same concept here. He said that particularly this was used in anti-smoking campaigns with adolescents. Adolescents are very, they could succumb to the peer pressure when their friends ask, just one puff, come on, try it out. These kind of things. So we definitely need to train them. So I would give them some kind of simulation. I would say, come on, try it. And you should be practicing how to resist, how to say no. Probably this is simulation. I won't be that persuasive, but the reality would be much more strong and persuasive. But if this training is given, they would be able to handle even the two-sided message, that if you talk both sides, you are exposed to the other side argument already in your mind, and you have generated some counter arguments in your mind. Because, see, attitude inoculation, there are two things. First, you are telling them somebody will come and try to change your attitude. You are creating a threat. Whenever there is a threat, you try to defend. So you are motivated now. Okay. And that will help you generate counter arguments. This refutational preemption is basically that giving your ability to refute the arguments. So giving you counter arguments. That is what we call attitude inoculation. So we are done with social persuasion. As promised, I will go to social influence. Before that, since I will go to reactance, then we will come to social influence, because reactance is much more closer to what we discuss here. So here we have reactance. This concept was given by Jack Brem. What he said is, this is again very human nature. I talked about the hard sell and soft sell, remember, in social persuasion. Whenever you feel that somebody is putting too much of pressure on you to buy a product, you will get irritated, annoyed. Why? Because you feel that that person is trying to overrun your freedom, take away your freedom of choice. Probably if that person has not put that much of pressure, you might have, bought that product or something like that, or accepted to that point of view. But if somebody is repeatedly annoying you with their, listen to me, then you might get this kind of drive state. That is what we call as reactance. So reactance, similar to dissonance, is an unpleasant motivational arousal state that pushes you, drives you to do something so that you feel that you have got your freedom back, that you have the freedom. Probably sometimes you will just do the opposite to tell yourself that, yeah, I'm a free person. It could happen. So that's why we need to be careful about not to trigger reactance when you try to persuade people. You should never overdo it. You need to be very careful. Tread carefully. Of course, it depends on what kind of audience, what kind of culture, all those things. But definitely, you need to be watching out for possibility of reactance. So basically, these people try to restore their freedom. And sometimes, sometimes you yourself might end up doing something which might make you feel that, why did I do it? Did I allow myself to be influenced? Something like that. And you feel loss of freedom. Or it could be purely from outside. It could be a physical barrier or something like that. Okay. Say you try to climb the tree and pluck a mango. You slipped and fell. Mango tree did not do it voluntarily, purposefully. It's a tree. but you sometimes get irritated. Today I will pluck this mango and then only I will go home. Because you feel your freedom is taken away sometimes. So it could be a physical barrier, or it could be somebody trying to force you into something. Whatever it is, internal or external, and basically reactance. It's emotional, it's motivational, it's cognitive, it's behavioral. That means in all these dimensions will have impact. Anger, aggression, that is emotion, motivation. In the thoughts you feel, see, when you think about it, whatever you are prevented from doing, that value will go up. If somebody says, please don't smoke, it's not healthy for you, then the value of smoking will be very high for you. And this threat to your freedom would also look very big to you. So the magnitude, and of course, other things like how big the threat is. If somebody is threatening you with such a force, then you will also have higher reactance. Interestingly, reactance can be direct or vicarious. Vicarious in the sense, it's nothing to do with you. Somebody is forcing somebody to do something. And seeing that, you develop reactance, even though it has nothing to do with you, but you feel, probably because of empathy, you are able to have reactance. And sometimes you may even interfere in that issue between two other people, or one is trying to persuade very forcefully the other. So it can be even vicarious. It could be, that's why, if it is my freedom, I will directly try to do something about it. I will say, please don't force me. I'm not going to buy your product. Or you say, don't smoke. Okay, right now I will smoke. Whatever. You will do something directly. Or indirect. Even if you watch somebody react to it, reactance which you got by seeing them will go down. Okay. Yeah. Then I think I have covered all those things, even though the earlier slide itself. Yeah. Reactance sometimes can happen below conscious threshold. It's more of a subtle annoyance. You do not know why. You have not even thought about it. You have not even thought that my freedom is under threat. But somebody repeatedly coming and knocking at your door and, hello sir, are you free today? Can I display my product and things like that? You have not even thought about it, but you get annoyed. Sometimes you get annoyed without even thinking why you got annoyed. That is what I'm talking about, outside consciousness reactance. Then say in case, if you are requested or forced to do something for which you cannot say no, for which you don't have a choice, you cannot say no, you have to do it. Then what will you do? Normally dissonance should happen. We will come to dissonance later. But in this case, what you will do? The only way to rationalize it. You will do that even though you feel initially it's against your own choice. Later on, you say, see, anyway, I think it's good that this person forced me. Otherwise, I would not have done this good thing. It's doing a lot of good things for my health. Something like that, you will rationalize it. Okay. So if there is a choice to counter, you will have reactance, and that will result in counter attitudinal behavior. If you don't have a choice to react, you will rationalize it. And whenever this issue is close to your heart, or something which you don't want to do, something which is very personally relevant, naturally, either reactance when there's a choice to do something about it, or rationalization, both will be stronger. Culture. This is becoming very important in today's psychology. In general, individualists, like, you might have heard this name, Hofstede, Geert Hofstede. This guy is, he was working for IBM. He was doing some research with IBM employees. And later on, he developed a general cross-cultural model to understand, of course, for him, the unit of culture is a nation, which may not be very accurate, but still, he has developed the 6D model of cultures. I'm not going to get into that now, but one of the main dimensions that we keep discussing about whenever we try to compare and understand cultures is individualism, collectivism. So individualism, as you know, the individual's choice is given more important. In collectivism, the larger group, family, society, whatever, those things are given more importance relatively. So individualists will feel, because individualists always think about, my freedom, my choice and things like that. So naturally reactance will be more high for these people than for collectivistic. But for collectivistic also, there could be reactance, okay? If because collectivists have a different self-concept, interdependent self-concept. I am brother of this person. I am son of that person. Our self itself, it's mixed with other people's self-concept. Such kind of things. So when such an image would be threatened, if I am forced to do something which would look bad to that interdependent self, say it may look like a less dutiful son or daughter, yeah, I would be also having reactance. But generally, individualists feel more reactance than collectivists. Then again, see, my own group, in group or out group, my race, my caste, my religion, whatever, in group. Out group is somebody who doesn't belong to these categories. For an individualist, whether it is the pressure to change comes from in group or out group doesn't matter, reactance will be there. But for collectivist, if it is coming from in group, they will feel less reactance because that's how the culture is. It's fair, normal, when others take decisions for you, when others tell you what to do. That's how collectivism. Children marry what the parents whom to marry, and all those kind of things. It's told, and that's how it is. So this choice, others are taking decisions for me. Those are not big problems for collectivists. Okay, of course, it's very difficult because in today's globalized world, things are in a flux. A lot of transition happening. More on that later. I think the last slide of this reactants. When you ban products, you normally see, when suddenly prohibition comes, then the alcohol value goes up. Value in the sense people aspiration for that increases. Okay, hard sell approach, which I already discussed, or some kind of restriction. You can buy only this many, you can buy only until now, whatever, all those kind of things. It will indirectly create reactants. Any kind of reactants, it can be measured by some tools. One such tool which I came across is called psychological reactance scale, developed by Hong. Okay, so that is reactants. Now let's move to social influence. Again, I'm forgetting things. We will finish this and then move on that. Attitude change, or I will come to this because I think that's a very mixed kind of thing. So I would take up social influence itself. Yes, we'll finish social influence because I think the cultural component has both persuasions and influence. So I'll better finish this and move on that. So when we talk about social influence, which is targeted at the behavior change, which may or may not create an internal change. Just give me audio feedback because I'm not able to see any of you. Are you all there? Is it all clear? Is my audio video okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Fine. Conformity, compliance, obedience. I will briefly tell what is what, and then we'll move on to each of these things. Conformity is a person changing his or her behavior in line with the norms. Norms are basically expectations in society, how each person has to behave. That might vary according to your gender, your age, your position, whatever, your profession, all those things. Just nobody is requesting you, nobody is ordering you, just you change your behavior in line with the norms. That is conformity. Compliance. Compliance is basically you change your behavior in response to a request, by another person. Can you please remove your footwear? Can you please remain silent? All those kind of requests. It could be a very decent request or a very harsh request, but somebody is asking you to do something. Obedience is an order coming from an authority, or at least a perceived authority. real authority or not, because authority could be a sanctioned, legitimate one, or somebody with a gun. So I'm not getting into that. But an order from an authority, that is obedience. Okay, let's get into it. This is Solomon Asch. I am trying to include pictures. In future, I will be doing this more and more. Nobody is going to ask you a picture-based question in net. But there is something called dual processing theory, Alan Pavio. Whenever you record information in more than one mode, that is why today modern books are printed in color. They give you all these pictures and stuff like that, so that it stays in your. But many a times you don't get the pictures in a very clear manner of the psychologists. I'll try to do that. So this is Solomon Asch, who has contributed immensely to. He is also one of the person who believes in the Gestaltist approach. So Solomon Asch was his experiment on conformity is one of the classic experiment, very famous experiment. You all might be knowing about it. So in the research, except one, all the other people are actors. They are research participants. But the person who participates doesn't know. He or she thinks that others are like him or her who have come to participate in the experiment. One line is shown, then that line is taken off from the screen. Then they show 3 lines and they ask which of the 3 lines you saw earlier. It was a very simple thing. So you could see this one, the medium one, because this is too long, this is too short. This is the one. So such a simple common sense thing, but I think there were various versions of this experiment. He himself did multiple trials, but overall, close to 75% of participants, at least once, they told a stupid answer just because others told it. That is the power of conformity. It is the power of conformity. So in fact, it's an eye-opener for all of us to understand how powerful the norms are. Why it's so difficult to resist social pressure. It's an invisible one, but so powerful. Okay, let's get into the details. There are certain issues. Basically, humans want to do things correctly. So nobody wants to do mistakes. Nobody wants to do stupid things. They want to do it correctly. You want to get the correct information from others. You want to be correct. So that is the informational social influence. That is always there. So probably here people felt that probably, I think this is right. A lot of people are telling that it should be right. If everybody is running one side, most probably you will also run that side only because it should be right. Something should be right. Okay. So that is informational social influence. Another thing is normative social influence. You want to be liked by others. You want to be accepted by others. Very simple. This is human nature, no? For all of us. When you go into a restaurant, you do not know how to eat. For example, a different cuisine. You do not know how to use what is that, chopsticks and stuff like that, or how to eat sushi and things like that. Then definitely you look around for information. What's the right way? So we are allowing ourselves to be socially influenced. Normative influences, we would like to be part of a group. We would like to be friends with our classmates. It's all there. So because of these influences, probably these are very important for our survival. That's why it's there. People can conform to the norms. He did variations in the experiments and found out that if the task is very difficult, then the conformity increases because people think that it's very difficult. Probably I think what they say is right. You do not know the answer. So what others say should be right. Task difficulty more, conformity more. Group cohesiveness high. Say if it's in reality, if it's a very tight group and there is a norm, probably I would go with that. I would go with that. This is how the terrorism and other kind of things, very tight groups. You cannot go against a norm. You will go with that. That is the pressure the cohesiveness puts on you. That group sustainability is very important for all of us. So that more cohesive, more conformity. Collectivism, yes, more conformity would be there. Individualism, relatively less conformity. And there are some people, like the individual trait, some people who always want to stand outside. in the sense that they want to be different. They want to be unique. Such kind of people uh, won't be coming into the conformity pressure. Then descriptive norms. So descriptive norms is opposite to injunctive norms. Injunctive norms tells you what you should be doing. Descriptive norms is what others are doing right now. You are able to see that right now what others are doing. That's descriptive norms. And what should be done, what ideally should be done. Compared to that, the descriptive norms have a greater power on you so that you conform to that. Group size, he says if the group size is 3, probably 3 plus 1, I believe. So if the group size is 3, or let's assume you included 2 plus 1. 2 people are saying one answer. You tend to come under the conformity pressure. That's a minimal number. But I believe 3 to 7 should be ideal. Beyond number, if it's too large, then people will suspect something is wrong, something is amiss. The conformity pressure goes up. But say 3 to 7, it's kind of puts a pressure on you. So that is, these are the things which he discovered when he did the variations in the experiment. This is Cialdini. Compliance. Sometimes this is called 6th principle of social influence, 6th principle of persuasion. It's used in marketing and all. So we are going to see the 6 principles of compliance, where I talked about giving explicit request and things like that. So we are moving on to the 6 principles of compliance. We are moving on to those things. So we have something called, I always use the acronym method to remember things. So you could see this FARC SS. Friendship, authority, reciprocity, consistency, social validation, scarcity. Okay, friendship, authority, reciprocity, consistency, social validation, scarcity. So friendship is basically, it need not be deep friendships, but basically some kind of give and take positive relationship. If that is established, then it's easy to persuade the other person. That is why smart marketing people try to make friends with you. Anybody. Somebody is preaching a religion, somebody is trying to influence you to become vegan, or somebody is trying to sell you a book or a product or a service, whatever it is. Establishing a kind of good relationship is very important, where you try to make that person feel good about yourself. You dress well, you speak decently, politely, you praise them. Of course, this has to be done in a proper way. Then that's what we call ingratiation and building a friendship. Then it works. Then you have authority. Here, when I say authority, it's not like the order from the authority as we are going to see in obedience. This is, authority figure. Probably he or she doesn't have the real power to order you, but nevertheless, that person is an authority figure, and that person requests you. If a policeman requests, I don't have money with me, so I'm not paying you money, to the roadside tea seller, please bear with me. Just a request. Most probably you will go with this request because it comes from a authority or a perceived authority. Even though it's a request, it's not an order, it is not tied up with explicit rewards and punishments. Still, using the authority position to make the request, your request, more powerful. That is what the authority principle of compliance is. Then going to reciprocity, I already talked about what is reciprocity, so I'm not going to explain it further. There are 3 techniques based on reciprocity. I have used only the acronyms here. The first one is door in the face technique. Door in the face technique, foot in the mouth technique. That's not all technique. Door in the face technique is where you start with a large request. You say that you go to, as a college student, you go to a sponsor, you say that we have a college cultural event, we need a 5 lakh sponsorship. What? 5 lakh? Then you say, okay, sir, please try to give us 25,000 or something like that. Probably that person is likely to say yes, because you came down putting a pressure on reciprocity on the other person. I have to come down. This is what happens in bargaining also. You come down, that other person is under pressure to come down. So that is door in the face technique. Foot in the mouth technique is absolutely unnecessary accepting of a request of somebody where you don't need to have done it. It is just that person smiled at you. That's it. Nothing more. You have nothing to lose, but you unnecessarily just because this is what happens in sometimes somebody when you get into a train or a bus, they smile and say good evening, things like that. After some time they'll ask, can you please shift this? I would like to have the window seat, please. Probably just because of that smile, there is no ingratiation, there is no friendship built here, nothing. Just a small gesture, but because of that gesture, you have obligatory pressure. You could reciprocate with a smile and say sorry, but we don't do it. We go with that request, and even though we may not like it, we may, and then we will have dissonance. Then we may rationalize it, and all those kind of things. Okay, but that is why it calls foot. You are putting your own foot in your mouth. It's a stupid kind of stuff. Foot in the mouth technique. That's not all technique. What you do is, say for example, if you're trying to persuade somebody to make them believe that this is the right product for them. They should buy this thing right now. So what you do is you don't talk about a special offer until that last minute when that person is kind of sitting on the fence. You just need to push that fellow a little bit. He will fall for you. At that time, you'll say, "Sir, that's not all. I think let me get back to you in a few minutes." And I said, "I just spoke to my manager, and I have got a permission to give you a special package along with it, free of cost. It's on us." And you put that thing, and this is not the only thing. We have this also, but the last minute you put it. That again puts a pressure. That guy is so nice, he tries to do something good for you. Why not you reciprocate it by saying yes and sign the check? That's it. So that's not all technique. Then we have consistency, where this is opposite. The first one is called foot in the door technique. Let me go through the slide and then we'll have a 5 minutes break. Okay, I don't want to leave it halfway. So this the first one is foot in the door technique, exactly opposite of door in the face technique. You start with a small request and slowly escalate the request. This is how a person who gets say a loan of 100 rupees, probably when that person comes back and asks you a bigger loan, maybe some will say no, but most of us will go ahead. We will find it difficult to say no once we have said yes. Okay, so because of the consistency principle, we want to be seen ourselves as consistent people, behaving in a consistent manner. So that is why this foot in the door operates on us. Then the low ball technique, it's an unethical technique. Low ball technique, what you do is you persuade somebody. This is initially put up in the marketing field. That's why examples are also like that. You try to force somebody to accept something, and the last minute you say that sorry, there is an error in calculation. I forgot to add this new tax. Unfortunately, I'm very sorry. So putting the tax, it comes to this amount. So you know that that person has agreed to it, and then push this at the last minute. There's a possibility that people can say no, but a lot of people end up saying yes because they've already mentally decided to go ahead, and maybe they will be unhappily sign the check, but they will go ahead. So that is the low ball technique. The last one is on consistency, is called bait and switch technique. You put a bait, then you switch that person to another thing. For example, 50% off, a store sells something, you go in there, that's a bait. You see only one shelf with some outdated clothes, not so good looking, or only sizes of 40, 42 waist size, plus size thing are there. And but see, the new stuff has come on which we have 5% off. So you are baited with that and switched to something else. Bait and switch technique, not so ethical, but people do that. Then you have scarcity principle. Say that today, the last day of sale. Yesterday a message came from Amazon midnight sale, only a few hours left. things like that. So put a pressure of scarcity. After this, you won't get it. Probably next week there will be another sale, all those things. But they will always put this idea of scarcity. Things are scarce, and you need to say yes. You need to buy it right now, and maybe you could bring about changes in people's behavior, saying that if you switch to electric now, you will get this additional benefit, tax benefit, which you may not get later on. So making people go green and things like that, you could bring these kind of behaviors based on these compliance principles. Lastly, social validation. Social validation is something like, see, this is the trend. This is what everybody buys. This is what everybody does. So you put a kind of conformity pressure through compliance. This is what everybody, this is the norm. This is a trend. This is a fashion. So get on to the bandwagon. There is something called social bandwagon effect. Get on to the bandwagon. Let's all go together. This is what everybody does. Most of us, except few, would not like to stand odd, to be an odd person. So we may also go with that. Sometimes the textile guys say this is the moving piece, fast moving piece. Yesterday I got this many, I sold it. Only one piece left. The scarcity principle is also there, but social validation is also there. Okay. Beyond this, certain things like if you want to affiliate to a group, or if you are part of the group, then you are more likely to comply to that. If you find some kind of similarity between the person who is persuading you, you are more likely to say yes. And if the person comes in person and stands near you and makes this request, you are more likely to do it than if he or she is doing it on phone or through mail, email, or something like that. Very subtle, simple things. This works on almost, both the things. This person staying nearby, things like that can work on obedience also. Moving on to the other techniques. Apart from this, you could request and put compliance pressure on other people through complaining. You just keep complaining to stop this annoying complaints. People may say yes to whatever you are addressing through the complaints. There is something called pick technique, first discovered by Santos. Say if a beggar approaches you and asks for, can you give me 500 rupees, please? You will definitely be shocked. What? Maybe if he's asking and he's just, shaking his or her begging bow, probably you might not even look up from your mobile phone and look at that person's face. You will just say, no, no, no. You will keep going, right? To stop that automatic no script, you shock them, you surprise them. Probably, of course, I gave a very hypothetical example. The actual example, you could go and check it out, Santos, the pick technique. So you surprise them and stop them and make them, just reflect on your request. Probably they may say yes, not to 500 rupees, but not in this case, but something else, probably which you would have routinely said no. Say, for example, a college student comes and says, do you have a few minutes? I want to do a survey. Probably these kind of students are roaming around with the survey form. You'll say no, no. Probably that person, I don't know, surprises you with a chocolate or surprises you with a request. Can you sign your name on my palm or something like that? And then, talks about the survey. Yeah, you may say yes to that. Okay. Putting others in good mood. This is the classical wine and dine method of persuasion. You make people happy and then put the persuasive message, a request. They are more likely to say yes. I need a break. So I wanted to finish this slide, but I'm just getting tired. We'll have a 5-minute break and get back. What I will do is I'm going to quit and rejoin. So you could also do the same. Sharp 5 minutes, we are getting back. Okay.